Now taking a look at more themes coming from the African Development Bank. Well, since the COP17 conference held earlier this year in Durban, the focus on climate change seems to be falling under the radar. Earlier we caught up with Aly Abou-Sabaa, Director of the Climate Change at the African Development Bank, to find out what the bank was doing to ensure Africa was able to withstand the effects of climate change.
It's true, maybe the headlines have, fewer headlines on climate change, but certainly not for the African Development Bank. Our teams in the African Development Bank are trying to work to address the key issues that have been flagged during the Durban conference. African countries have expressed, for instance, key concerns about the low access to existing climate resources from global instruments. This is due to a variety of reasons, such as the limited capacity of African countries, limited knowledge of procedures and so on and so forth. So we're trying to work to build African countries' capacity to be able to access some of these resources. We also have our own climate change action plan, which envisages to invest up to $6 billion over a 5-year period in areas related to climate work, largely in the area of building resilience within African economies, focusing on adaptation, but also a number of clean energy programs, areas of capacity building, areas of policy planning, policy advice, but also to put in place the enabling environment for private sector to become as a key player in this particular area of climate work.
You talk about capacity utilization and the lack of capacity within African countries to try and ensure that they are taking advantage of these programs. So I'd imagine that makes the program long-term rather than a short-term fix.
Well, you see, Africa is not one country. You have a continent with 53, so there are countries. We classify our countries in 4 or 5 different categories, and depend on the level of preparedness. You have the middle income countries, you have the low income, you have countries with the right set of policies and strategies, countries with the right staff capacity and institutions to deliver, but also on the other side you have countries which are on the opposite side of these, and a range of other countries in between. So we try to assist as many countries as we can, but recognizing the differences, and that some of them are able to access immediately, but some others we need to have first their capacities built before they can actually embark.
Now, who's funding these initiatives? Because I imagine in this world where people are looking for hard returns, clear-cut returns that they are able to measure, to invest in something as long-term as climate change, it must be difficult to raise funds to support your work.
It is very true, and we encourage countries not to only look at how much resources we can make available from our pot as the African Development Bank, but we're also trying to leverage and access funding from global instruments that are available to African countries. More importantly, Africa needs to take full ownership of its own challenges and include the questions of building resilience within the countries, within their own economies, and try to help put the right policy environment and enable environment for the private sector nationally to be able to play an important role into the process.
Globally, the discussion around climate change is moving on. Next week we've got Rio +20 coming up in Brazil. Take us through some of the key issues that will be debated there and what the role of the bank will be at those meetings.
Well, you see, going to Rio +20, Africa has been able to come up with a very clear set of issues that they are taking to the negotiating table. Now, it's a long list, but I can mention a few.
Sure, just top line.
Africa wants a renewed political commitment for all the pledges that have been made through so many global summits in the past. It's important that there is a renewed political commitment for sustainable development, and that the means to implement those are also made available. Questions of urbanization for Africa are critical. Questions of energy access. 40% of African population don't have the right access to energy instruments, and a range of other things. But what is of critical importance for Africa is the question of green development or green economy. This is something that we recognize that Africa has a great potential in terms of embarking and adopting policies that would actually position African countries into this path. But this requires a lot of capacity building, it requires a lot of national and sectoral planning. And then when you do that, you need to be mindful and fully aware of what will be the means of implementation. So that it's not just additional set of plans that are shelved, but also will find themselves in form of implementation.
How hopeful are you that these things will be accomplished?
Well, we are quite hopeful that at least some of the key issues, such as green development, will be clarified. That African countries, some of whom have already demonstrating leadership, such as Ethiopia, Rwanda, Mozambique and others, in actually without waiting for the global community to come forward, they have taken full control of their own future and have already started to take steps in the right direction. The African Development Bank is keen and stands ready to be able to support those countries who are willing to move in this direction, both in terms of building the capacity but also with the resources to actually implement those plans on the ground.